Charles was halfway through saying, "Juliet," when he realized the nursery was completely empty. Not quiet. Empty. Both cribs were bare, the diaper bag was gone, and even the tiny blanket he had watched Juliet fold over their daughter every night had disappeared. He hurried into their bedroom and stopped at the closet. Her clothes were missing, her shoes were missing, her toiletries were gone. But then he saw the nightstand. Juliet's wedding ring was sitting there. Charles picked it up and stared at it. For a moment he couldn't move. He called her. Nothing. Again, nothing. Then his eyes moved around the room, taking in the things she had deliberately left behind. Her favorite photograph. The old sweater she refused to throw away. The little box where she kept the twins' hospital bracelets. She hadn't packed in anger. She had packed with enough time to decide what mattered. Charles slowly sat on the edge of the bed, still holding her ring. He had come home expecting to find his wife and newborn twins. Instead, he was sitting in their bedroom, holding the one thing Juliet had chosen to leave behind. And suddenly, the empty house didn't feel like the beginning of an argument. It felt like the end of something that had started long before this morning. Welcome to Greer Stories, my amazing family. Stay close, because Charles is about to discover that Juliet's disappearance did not begin the morning he came home. Charles checked the nursery a second time because the first time it made no sense. The cribs were still there. The rocking chair was still there. The little stuffed rabbit Juliet's mother had brought from Ohio was still sitting on the shelf, but the twins were gone. Charles stood between the two empty cribs, staring down at the mattresses, as if the babies might somehow appear if he waited long enough. "Juliet?" His voice sounded strange in the room. No answer. He walked back downstairs. The kitchen looked almost untouched. 2 mugs sat beside the sink, one of them half full. The bottle warmer was still on the counter. The sterilizer was clean and empty. He opened the refrigerator, then stopped. What am I doing? He shut the door and pulled out his phone. He called Juliet. It rang, and rang, then went to voicemail. "Juliet, call me." He hung up. 3 seconds later he called again. Nothing. Charles rubbed his face and looked toward the front door. Her car was gone. That should have been enough. Instead, his mind kept looking for another explanation. Maybe she had taken the twins to her mother's. Maybe she was furious. Maybe she had found out. The last thought made him sit down. He stared at Juliet's name on his phone. Then he called her mother. It rang twice. "Hello? Mrs. Bennett, where's Juliet?" There was a pause. Not the kind that happened when someone was trying to remember something. The kind that happened when someone already knew what they were going to say. "She's here." Charles straightened. "The twins? They're here too." He closed his eyes. "Okay, good. Put her on the phone." Another pause. "I can't do that." "What do you mean you can't? She's not ready to talk to you." "Not ready." Charles stood. "She took my children out of the house without telling me." "They're safe." "I didn't ask if they're safe. I asked to speak to my wife." His mother-in-law said nothing. Charles looked toward the stairs. "I need to know what happened." "You know what happened." His stomach tightened. "Did she tell you?" "No, she didn't tell us everything." "Then what are you talking about?" "Charles, she's not ready. I need to talk to her." "She doesn't want to talk right now." "Then when?" "I don't know." He gripped the counter. "I'm their father. I know. I have a right to see them. I know that too." "Then why are you keeping them from me?" "We aren't." "Then let me come get them." "No." The answer came so quickly that Charles stopped. "You can't be serious." "I am." He heard a faint sound in the background. A baby. His chest tightened. "Let me talk to my son." "Charles, please." His mother-in-law lowered her voice. "Today isn't the day to make this worse." "Make what worse?" She didn't answer. Charles looked around the kitchen again. The missing bottles, the empty diaper bag, the clean counters. Everything was beginning to look different. Not abandoned, organized. "You knew she was leaving?" "No." "Then when did she tell you?" "She didn't." "Then how did she get there?" "Charles, please." "When?" His mother-in-law took a breath. "She's been planning for a while." The line went quiet. Charles stared at the wall. For what? But the call had already ended. He lowered the phone slowly. For several seconds he didn't move. Then anger came in where confusion had been. He called his parents. His mother listened while he explained what had happened. When he finished, she said, "She can't just take the children because she's upset. That's what I'm saying." His father joined the call. "Did she leave a note?" "No." "Did she tell you where she was going?" "No." "Then don't panic. She'll come around." Charles looked toward the empty staircase. "I just need her to listen to me." His father was quiet. "Then make sure what you say is worth hearing." Charles didn't like that. He didn't answer. His mother spoke again. "Whatever happened between you two, you're still their father." "Exactly." The word settled something inside him. He was their father. He had been there. He had built a home with Juliet. He had made mistakes, yes, but mistakes weren't supposed to erase everything else. Charles picked up his keys. He wasn't going to beg. He wasn't going to let Juliet turn him into a stranger to his own children. He was going to get answers. But before he opened the front door, he looked upstairs one more time. The house was exactly where he had left it, except for the people who had made it feel like home. And suddenly, one thought wouldn't leave him alone. Why had Juliet packed like someone who had known exactly what morning would look like? Juliet was sitting on the edge of her parents' guest bed when Sarah came in carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You're not going to drink that, are you?" Juliet looked at the cup. "I might. You've been saying that for 20 minutes. Sarah set the coffee down anyway. In the bassinet beside the bed, one of the twins stirred. Juliet immediately leaned forward. "Hey!" She rested her hand against the baby's stomach until he settled again. Sarah watched her. "You should sleep. I know. You haven't slept. I know." Sarah pulled the chair closer. Neither woman spoke for a moment. Downstairs, Juliet's father was on the phone with someone. Her mother was moving quietly around the kitchen. Every few minutes the floor creaked. It was familiar. That helped, and somehow it also made everything harder. Juliet looked down at the twins. "They're going to ask me about him someday." Sarah didn't answer immediately. "Maybe." "What am I supposed to say? The truth?" Juliet gave a small laugh. "That gets complicated. Then tell them the truth when they're old enough to understand it." Juliet looked away. Her phone vibrated on the nightstand. "Charles." She didn't touch it. Sarah glanced at the screen. "You want me to turn it off?" "No." "You want to answer?" Juliet shook her head. "Not yet." Sarah nodded. She didn't ask why. That was one of the things Juliet appreciated about her. Most people wanted the whole story immediately. Sarah didn't. She waited. Eventually Juliet said, "He'll tell everyone I just left. He might. He'll say I was angry. Were you?" Juliet looked toward the window. "Yes." Sarah waited. Juliet rubbed her thumb against the edge of the blanket. "But that's not why I left." There it was, the sentence she'd been avoiding since she walked through her parents' front door. Sarah leaned forward. "Then why did you leave?" Juliet didn't answer. She looked down at the sleeping baby. For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was the soft hum of the fan. "I don't know how to explain it." "Try." Juliet swallowed. "It wasn't one thing." Sarah nodded. "I figured. It was little things." "Like what?" Juliet stared at the floor. "Appointments." Sarah's expression changed. "The pediatrician?" Juliet nodded. 3 times. She held up 3 fingers. "He said he'd come. He said work was busy. Then he said he'd make the next one. And he didn't. No." Juliet lowered her hand. "Then there was the night my mom had that procedure. You told me about that. He said he'd drive me. He didn't. He said he'd forgotten." Sarah was quiet. Juliet picked up the coffee and took a sip. It was cold. She set it back down. "I kept thinking it was temporary." "What was?" "All of it." She looked at Sarah. "The missed things, the promises, the way he'd say he'd make it up to me and then we'd just move on." Sarah didn't interrupt. Juliet looked toward the bassinet again. "When the twins were born, I thought maybe that would change him." Her voice became quieter. "For a little while, I thought it did." Sarah reached across and squeezed her hand. Juliet squeezed back. Then she pulled her hand away. "After that, I started keeping track." Sarah looked at her. "Keeping track?" Juliet nodded. "Dates, appointments, things he promised, things he didn't show up for. Why?" "I don't know." She paused. Maybe because I was starting to wonder if I was imagining it. Sarah's expression softened. Juliet looked toward the dresser. A folder sat there, plain, gray, no label on the front. She hadn't opened it since arriving. She didn't need to. She knew what was inside. Copies of appointment reminders, bank statements, messages, notes she'd written after arguments when she couldn't sleep. Things that had seemed too small to bring up at the time. Taken together, they didn't feel small anymore. Sarah followed her gaze. Edmund said you should keep everything. I know. He said not to delete anything. I know. Juliet rubbed her forehead. I don't want to spend the rest of my life collecting evidence against Charles. You don't have to. I already feel like I am. Sarah shook her head. You're protecting yourself. Juliet looked down. Maybe. Her phone vibrated again. Charles. This time she turned the screen face down. Sarah didn't comment. After a while, Juliet's mother appeared in the doorway. Your father wants to know if you're hungry. Juliet almost smiled. I'm okay. Her mother looked at her for a moment. You don't have to be okay. Juliet nodded. I know. Her mother glanced at the twins. Just don't let this become a war. It won't. They're his children too. I know. And whatever you think about Charles, I know, Mom. Her mother stopped. Juliet softened. I'm not trying to keep them from him. I know. I just don't trust him right now. Her mother nodded. That is different. After she left, Sarah looked at Juliet. You've already decided what you're doing about the twins. Yes. What about Charles? Juliet's eyes moved toward the phone. I don't know. Sarah studied her face. That's not the same as wanting him back. Juliet looked down. No. A long silence followed. Then Sarah asked the question she had been waiting to ask. When did you actually decide you were done? Juliet opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She looked at the gray folder, then at the twins, then toward the closed bedroom door. Finally, she whispered, It wasn't last night. Sarah didn't move. Juliet's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. It was before that. Her phone lit up again. Charles. Juliet watched his name disappear from the screen. Then she reached over and placed the phone beside the gray folder. She didn't pick up either one. By late afternoon, Charles was sitting across from Frederick in a quiet office downtown, with his phone face down on the desk. He'd already told the story twice. The second time, it sounded better. Juliet found out I was with someone, Charles said. She got angry, packed the babies, went to her parents. Frederick leaned back. And you came home after? Yes. Did you sleep there? Charles looked at him. No. Frederick nodded. And she left before you returned? Yes. Charles waited for some sign that the situation wasn't as serious as it felt. Frederick opened a folder. How long had things been difficult between you? They weren't. Frederick looked up. Charles, they had been stressed. We had newborns. We were both tired. That wasn't my question. Charles leaned back. I don't know. A few disagreements. About nothing unusual. Money? Sometimes. The children? Sometimes. Your work? She's complained about that. Frederick made a note. Charles watched him. What? Nothing. No. What? Frederick closed the folder. You said she found out about the affair. She did. And you think that's why she left? I know that's why she left. Frederick was quiet. Then he said, Juliet appears to have been preparing for separation before last night. Charles stared at him. No, I'm telling you what I'm seeing. No, she wasn't. Charles. She wouldn't have done that without telling me. Frederick's expression didn't change. She may have felt she had already told you. Charles frowned. What does that mean? It means people don't always announce when they're reaching the end. Charles looked away. He thought about the last few months. There had been arguments. Of course there had. They had newborn twins. Juliet had been tired. He had been working. Sometimes she got quiet. Sometimes she went to bed early. Sometimes she stopped talking halfway through an argument. But none of that meant she was planning to leave. She never said she wanted a divorce. Frederick nodded. Did you ever ask her? Charles opened his mouth, then closed it. Frederick waited. Not directly, Charles admitted. Why not? Because I knew she didn't mean it. Frederick raised an eyebrow. You knew? Charles rubbed his jaw. She always calmed down. That's different from saying she was fine. Charles didn't answer. Frederick reached into the folder. There is another issue. Charles looked up. What? Juliet has documentation. Of the affair? Some of it. Charles's shoulders relaxed slightly. Then that's all this is. Frederick shook his head. No. Charles waited. It's not just the affair. Something in Frederick's tone made him sit straighter. What else? Appointments. Charles frowned. What appointments? Medical appointments for the twins. I went to some. I know. Then what is the problem? Frederick glanced at his notes. There are several records showing you were expected to attend and didn't. Charles stared at him. She knew I was working. Apparently. She knew my schedule. I understand. And there were times I couldn't leave. Frederick nodded. That's what she wrote down too. Charles looked at him. What does that mean? It means she documented the explanation. A silence settled between them. Frederick continued. There are also messages about expenses, canceled plans, and other disagreements. Charles shook his head. Those are marriage problems. Yes. So why are we talking about them like they're evidence? Because if custody becomes contested, patterns matter. Charles looked down at the desk. He suddenly felt irritated with Juliet all over again. She had been keeping records, writing things down, saving messages, while he had been living in the same house. How long? Frederick didn't answer immediately. How long what? How long has she been doing this? I don't know. Charles stared at him. You have the file. I have information. I don't have every answer. Charles leaned forward. Can I see it? Frederick hesitated. Not yet. Why? Because you're angry. I'm not going to do anything. I didn't say you would. Then give it to me. Frederick closed the folder. Go home tonight. Charles gave him a disbelieving look. My wife took my children. Your children are safe. That isn't the point. I know. Charles stood. I need to know what she's saying about me. Frederick remained seated. Then you're going to have to be ready for the possibility that some of it is true. Charles stopped. He looked at Frederick for several seconds. Then he gave a short laugh. You've known me for 12 years. I have. You know what kind of father I am. I know what you've told me. The answer landed differently than Charles expected. He picked up his phone. There were 7 missed calls from his mother. 1 message from his father. Nothing from Juliet. Charles slipped the phone into his pocket. She's trying to punish me. Frederick didn't respond. Charles looked at him. You think I'm wrong. I think you don't know yet. That was the first thing anyone had said all day that Charles couldn't immediately argue with. He walked toward the door. His hand was already on the handle when Frederick spoke again. Charles. He turned. If Juliet has been keeping records for months, don't assume the affair is the whole case. Charles said nothing. Find out what you missed. Charles left the office without answering. In the parking garage, he sat behind the wheel for several minutes before starting the engine. He thought about the empty nursery, the missing bottles, Juliet's wedding ring. Then he remembered something he hadn't thought about in months. A night in their kitchen. Juliet had been standing beside the sink, holding one of the twins against her shoulder. She had asked him, quietly, "Do you even notice when you're not here?" He had laughed. He thought she meant physically. He had told her, "I'm right here." She hadn't argued. She had simply looked at him for a moment and said, "Okay." Charles had forgotten about that conversation. Until now. He started the car. For the first time, the word okay didn't sound like agreement. It sounded like something else, and Charles wasn't sure he wanted to find out what. Months before Juliet left, before the twins were born, she had already started noticing how often Charles was somewhere else. Not necessarily another place, just somewhere else. She would be talking to him at dinner, and he would be checking his phone. She would ask about the weekend, and he'd say, "We'll figure it out." She would ask when he was coming home, and he'd answer, "Soon." Most of the time, Juliet believed him. She wanted to. After the twins were born, though, soon became harder to live with. 3 months before she left, Juliet stood in the pediatrician's office holding one of the babies while Charles's empty chair sat beside her. The nurse glanced toward the doorway. "Is Dad coming?" Juliet looked at the clock. "He's supposed to. Traffic? Work," she said it quickly. The nurse nodded and continued checking the baby's weight. Juliet kept looking at the door anyway. Charles had promised. The night before, he had stood in the kitchen loosening his tie. "I mean it, Jules. I'll move the meeting." She had smiled. Okay, he hadn't. After the appointment, Juliet sat in her car with the baby sleeping against her chest. Her phone buzzed. "Charles, I'm sorry. Meeting ran long. How did it go?" She stared at the message, then typed, "Everything's fine." She almost added, "I wish you'd been here." She deleted it. When she got home, Charles had already sent money for the appointment. She saw the notification while unloading the diaper bag. For a moment, she felt guilty for being disappointed. He was working. He was paying the bills. He was trying to take care of them. That had to count for something. She told herself it did. A week later, he missed dinner with her parents. Again. Her father had grilled too much food. Her mother kept checking the driveway. When Juliet's phone rang, she stepped outside. "Hey." Charles sounded tired. "I can't make it." Juliet closed her eyes. "They've been waiting." "I know." "You said you'd be here." "I know, Juliet." There was a pause, then quieter. "I've got a lot going on right now." She looked through the window at her father setting another plate on the table. "What kind of work thing is it?" "Just business." She wanted to ask what that meant. She didn't. "Okay, I'll make it up to you." "You always say that." Silence. Juliet immediately regretted saying it. Charles exhaled. "I said I'm sorry. I know." She hung up. When she went back inside, her mother looked at her face. "Everything okay?" Juliet smiled. "Yeah. He's just busy." Her mother nodded. Nobody asked another question. That became Juliet's answer to almost everything. He's just busy. When Charles came home late, he was just busy. When he missed another appointment, he was just busy. When he canceled the weekend they had planned with the twins, he was just busy. When Juliet ate dinner alone more nights than she wanted to admit, he was just busy. The explanation was simple, and because it was simple, it allowed her to keep going. Sarah noticed before anyone else did. One evening she found Juliet standing in the kitchen with a bottle in one hand and a cold dinner sitting untouched beside her. "You ate?" Juliet looked down. "I will." Sarah glanced at the plate. "That thing has been there since I got here. I've been feeding them. I can see that." Juliet smiled faintly. Sarah picked up the plate. "You want me to heat it?" "No." "You sure?" "I'm fine." Sarah studied her. "You say that a lot." Juliet looked away. "Because I am." Sarah didn't argue. She just put the plate in the microwave. When it beeped, Juliet took it without saying thank you. She sat at the table and ate 3 bites. Then her phone buzzed. "Charles, running late." Juliet put the fork down. Sarah saw the message. "He coming home?" "Apparently. Tonight." Juliet gave her a look. Sarah laughed softly. "I'm kidding." Juliet smiled despite herself. For a few minutes they talked about nothing important. The twins, a television show Sarah had started watching, her mother's habit of buying too many groceries. Juliet laughed once, a real laugh. Then the front door opened. Charles walked in carrying 2 shopping bags. "I brought dinner." Juliet looked at him. "What is it?" "Your favorite." He set the bags on the counter. Sarah smiled. "Look at you." Charles laughed. "I'm trying." Juliet watched him unpack the food. He had remembered her favorite. He had brought enough for everyone. He kissed her forehead as he passed. For a few minutes the house felt normal again. That was the problem. Charles didn't have to be terrible every day. He only had to be present often enough to make Juliet believe the next week might be different. Later that night, after Sarah left, Juliet stood in the bedroom doorway while Charles changed his shirt. "You really going to make the appointment Friday?" He looked at her through the mirror. "Yeah." "You're sure?" I said yes. She nodded. "Okay." Charles smiled. "You don't trust me?" Juliet looked at him. She wanted to say something. Instead, she smiled too. "I do." And she meant it. At least she meant that she wanted to, because admitting otherwise would have meant admitting something much harder, that every time she defended Charles to someone else, she was also trying to convince herself. The first time Juliet wrote something down, it wasn't because she was angry. She was sitting in her car outside the pediatrician's office, waiting for one of the twins to finish a bottle. She opened the notes app on her phone. Friday. Charles said he'd come. He didn't. She stared at the sentence. Then she almost deleted it. It looked petty. She put the phone down instead. 2 weeks later, she added another. Saturday canceled dinner with Mom and Dad. Said work came up. Then another. Monday. Promised he'd call after the meeting. Didn't. She wasn't building a case. At least that's what she told herself. She was trying to remember. That was the part that bothered her. Sometimes Charles would apologize, and she would forgive him. A few days later, she'd remember that something had bothered her, but she couldn't remember exactly what had happened. Had he really promised? Had she misunderstood? Had she been too tired? With newborn twins, she questioned herself constantly. Maybe she was expecting too much. Maybe every new mother felt this exhausted. Maybe Charles really was doing everything he could. He was working. He was paying the bills. He was sending money whenever something came up. He never complained about the mortgage. He bought groceries. He told her he loved her. So why did she feel alone? She didn't know. And because she didn't know, she started writing things down. Not every day. Only when something stayed with her after she wished it wouldn't. A missed appointment, a canceled plan, a promise, a conversation, an expense that didn't make sense. One evening she wrote, asked him if we were okay. He said, "We're fine." She stared at it for a long time. Then she added, "I don't think he heard the question." She closed the phone. The next morning Charles brought her coffee. He kissed the top of her head. "Morning," Juliet smiled. "Morning." He looked at the babies. "How'd they sleep?" "Not much, yeah." He picked up his cup. "I'll try to get home early tonight." Juliet watched him leave. She didn't write that down. She wanted that promise to be true. A month later, Sarah found the notes by accident. Juliet had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she went upstairs. Sarah wasn't reading them. She saw the list because a notification opened the screen. "What's this?" Juliet came downstairs. She stopped. Sarah immediately turned the phone over. "I wasn't snooping." "I know." Juliet picked it up. Sarah hesitated. "You've been keeping track?" Juliet sat down. "Not like that." "Like what?" "Like I'm collecting evidence." Sarah watched her. "Are you?" Juliet shook her head. "I don't know." That was the honest answer. Sarah sat beside her. "You don't have to prove that he's a bad husband." "I know." "Then why are you doing this?" Juliet looked at the phone. "Because sometimes I think I'm losing my mind." Sarah frowned. "What?" Juliet swallowed. "He'll promise something, then it won't happen. I'll get upset. We'll argue. He'll apologize. Then he'll do something nice, and I'll think maybe I made too much of it." She looked down. "And then a week later, I can't even remember what started the argument." Sarah didn't say anything. Juliet continued. "So I started writing it down. Just for you, just for me." Sarah nodded. That was all. She didn't tell Juliet to leave. She didn't tell her to stay. She didn't tell her what Charles was. She simply said, "Keep it." Juliet looked at her. "Why?" "Because if you're wrong, you'll have your answer." Juliet's eyes narrowed slightly. "And if I'm not?" Sarah didn't answer. She didn't need to. The notes grew slowly. Nothing dramatic. That was what made them difficult to read later. Tuesday said he'd be home by 7. Came home at 10:18. Thursday missed the twins' appointment. Sunday said we'd visit my parents. Canceled at 4:30. Wednesday, transferred money for the bills. That last one stayed there too. Juliet never removed the good things. If Charles helped, she wrote it down. If he kept a promise, she wrote that down too. She wasn't trying to create a story. She was trying to find one. Then came the night that changed the meaning of all of it. Juliet had been feeding the twins when Charles's phone lit up on the kitchen counter. He was in the shower. She wasn't looking for anything. The screen simply came alive. A woman's name appeared. Juliet stared at it. Then the message preview appeared beneath the name. She read it once, then again. Her hand stopped moving. Charles walked into the kitchen wearing a t-shirt, rubbing his hair dry with a towel. He saw her face. "What?" Juliet looked at the phone. "Who is she?" Charles stopped. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Then he said, "Juliet." She waited. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She simply looked down at the baby in her arms. Later that night, after Charles had gone downstairs, Juliet opened the Notes app. Her finger hovered over the screen. For months she had been writing down things she couldn't explain. Now she finally had an explanation. She typed one sentence. I wasn't imagining it. Then she put the phone down. She didn't write anything else, because suddenly she was no longer trying to figure out whether something was wrong. She was trying to decide what she was going to do about it. Charles didn't open the file until the next morning. He had spent most of the night telling himself he didn't need to. Frederick had said there were records. Fine. Juliet was hurt. She had every right to be angry. But angry people could make things look worse than they were. That was what Charles told himself. By 9 o'clock he was back in Frederick's office. Show me. Frederick looked at him. Are you sure? Charles pulled out the chair. Just show me. Frederick placed the gray folder on the desk. Charles stared at it for a moment before opening it. The first page was a printed appointment confirmation. Pediatric cardiology consultation. Charles frowned. I remember this. Frederick said nothing. Charles read the date. Then the note beneath it. Charles said he would attend. He canceled that morning. I had a meeting. Frederick turned the page. Another appointment. Another date. Another note. Charles leaned back. She knew I had work. Frederick nodded. Keep reading. Charles did. A canceled dinner, a missed family gathering, a message about a weekend trip, an expense Juliet had questioned, a promise to be home by 7, a note showing he arrived after 10. Charles shook his head. This is ridiculous. Frederick didn't respond. She wrote down everything. Not everything. Charles looked up. What? There are gaps. That somehow made it worse. Charles returned to the pages. The dates were familiar. That was what bothered him. He remembered the appointments. He remembered Juliet asking why he hadn't come. He remembered saying he was busy. He remembered saying he'd make it up to her. He remembered buying her flowers 2 days later. He remembered thinking that should have settled it. Then he reached a page that made him stop. Thursday, Charles said he'd be home early because I asked him to help with the twins. He didn't come home until 11:06. Charles stared at the number, 11:06. He remembered that night. He had gone out after work. He hadn't thought much about it. Juliet had been quiet when he came home. He had asked what was wrong. She had said nothing. He had accepted that answer. Charles rubbed his forehead. She could have told me. Frederick looked at him. She did. Charles looked up. When? You just said she was quiet. She said nothing was wrong. Frederick didn't argue. Charles turned another page. There were messages printed beneath the notes. One from Juliet. Can you please let me know if you're going to be late? I don't want to keep waiting. His response. I'm coming. Relax. Charles stared at it. He remembered sending that. At the time, he'd thought she was making too much of the situation. Now the message looked different. Not cruel, not even particularly harsh, just dismissive. He turned the page. Another message. I need you to tell me the truth about where the money is going. His response. It's business. I'll explain later. Charles frowned. I explained this. Frederick looked at him. Did you? Yes. When? Charles didn't answer. He turned another page. There were more notes, not accusations, just dates, questions, promises, explanations, and occasionally something good. Saturday, Charles took the twins for 2 hours so I could sleep. Charles paused. He looked at Frederick. She wrote that? Yes. Why? Because it happened. Charles looked back at the page. He remembered that Saturday. He'd taken the babies downstairs. Juliet had slept for almost 3 hours. He'd felt good about helping her. He'd even told his father later that he was finally getting the hang of being a dad. Charles turned another page. There were more good moments, then more disappointments. The pages weren't organized to make him look terrible. They were simply there. That was what unsettled him. Juliet hadn't written only what hurt. She had written what happened. Charles leaned back. For the first time, he didn't know which version of the marriage was his. His memories were full of individual moments. Juliet's records connected them. You see the problem? Frederick asked. Charles looked at him. No, you're remembering events. She's remembering the pattern. Charles looked back down. The sentence bothered him because it sounded too simple. Yet he couldn't dismiss it. He turned another page, then another. He recognized almost every date. He remembered every apology, every promise to do better. Every time he had assumed things were fine because Juliet had stopped arguing. His throat tightened. Why didn't she just leave? Frederick didn't answer immediately. Charles looked at him. She could have told me. She may have thought she was telling you. Charles looked down again. Then he saw the last page. It wasn't a note. It was a printed message. Juliet had sent it to him 3 months earlier. I don't need you to fix everything. I just need to know I'm not carrying this marriage by myself. Charles read it twice, then a third time. He remembered receiving it. He remembered being in the middle of a meeting. He remembered looking at the message. He remembered thinking, we'll talk tonight. They never did. Charles put the page down. For several seconds he stared at his hands. Frederick didn't speak. Neither did Charles. Finally he closed the folder. I didn't know. Frederick's voice was quiet. I believe you. That wasn't comforting. Charles stood. I need to take this. Frederick stopped him. Not yet. Charles frowned. Why? Because you're still reading it as a defense of yourself. Charles looked at the folder. Frederick continued. Read it again when you're ready to see why she wrote it. Charles didn't answer. He left the office without the file. In the parking lot, he sat in his car with both hands resting on the steering wheel. He looked at the empty passenger seat. For a moment, he could almost picture Juliet sitting there beside him on the drive home from the hospital. He remembered her turning toward him. He remembered her asking something. He couldn't remember what. That bothered him more than it should have. What he did remember was his answer. We'll talk later. Charles stared through the windshield. He had said that a lot, and suddenly he wasn't sure how many conversations he had quietly turned into never. Charles kept reading. At first he expected to find something that would prove Juliet had exaggerated. Instead he found things he remembered. A Saturday morning when Juliet had asked him to take the twins so she could shower. He had said, give me 10 minutes. Then an email came through. He had spent the next hour answering messages. Juliet eventually took the babies herself. Charles remembered that day differently. He remembered working. The record said, Saturday asked Charles to watch them while I showered. He said yes. I waited 40 minutes. Finally took them with me. Charles stopped reading. 40 minutes. He hadn't known she was waiting. He turned the page. Another entry. Sunday family dinner canceled at 5:12. Charles said something came up at work. Mom asked if everything was okay. Told her he was busy. Charles remembered that dinner. He'd been exhausted. He had felt guilty about canceling. He'd sent Juliet flowers the next morning. At the time, that had seemed like enough. He turned another page. Tuesday, asked Charles if he could be home before the twins' bedtime. He said yes. Came home after they were asleep. Charles frowned. I told her I was sorry. Frederick sat across from him. You did. Charles looked up. How do you know? It's in the messages. Charles looked back down. There it was. His message. Sorry. Today got away from me. Juliet's response. Okay. Nothing else. He remembered seeing that word. He had assumed the conversation was over. Now he wondered if it had been the opposite. He continued. The records weren't dramatic. That was what made them difficult. There was no single day that looked like the day a marriage should end. There was a grocery receipt Juliet had saved because Charles had told her he couldn't afford something she needed for the twins, then spent nearly the same amount on a business dinner that evening. There was a message about a weekend trip they had planned. Are we still going? His response had come 6 hours later. Probably not. Sorry. There was no argument afterward. Juliet had simply canceled the hotel. Another page. Charles came home at 1:17 a.m., didn't explain where he'd been, said he was tired. I didn't ask. Charles stared at that one longer. He remembered the night. He remembered Juliet being awake. He remembered seeing her sitting on the couch with the television muted. He had kissed her forehead and gone upstairs. He had thought she was waiting because she couldn't sleep. He hadn't asked why. He turned another page, then another. There were moments where he had been kind, moments where he had shown up, moments where Juliet had written that he made her laugh. One entry said, Thursday Charles stayed home with the babies while I took a nap. I woke up feeling like myself again. Charles smiled faintly. He remembered that day. For a moment he wanted to hold on to it. Then he noticed what came after it. I wish there were more days like this. The smile disappeared. Charles closed his eyes. That sentence bothered him more than the angry ones, because there had been good days, there really had. He hadn't imagined that. Neither had Juliet. They had simply been surrounded by days that weren't. He kept going. A conversation about money, a promise he had forgotten, a birthday dinner shortened because of work, a message Juliet had sent at 9:43 p.m. "Can you just talk to me for 5 minutes?" His response, "Not tonight. I'm exhausted. Tomorrow?" There was no reply from her. Charles remembered waking up the next morning and thinking everything was fine because she had made breakfast. He had eaten. He had kissed her goodbye. He had gone to work. He had never asked whether she had slept. Frederick watched him turn another page. "You don't have to finish it today." Charles shook his head. No. He kept reading. Then he reached an entry from several weeks before the affair. Asked Charles if he still wanted this marriage. He said, "Of course." Then his phone rang, and he walked outside to take the call. We never finished the conversation. He remembered the phone call. He remembered stepping outside. He remembered thinking he'd come back in. He never did. He'd gone to bed that night believing he'd answered her question. He hadn't. He looked down at the file. For years Charles had judged his marriage by the moments when everything seemed fine. Dinner, bills paid, birthdays remembered, bills covered, a kiss before leaving for work. He had counted those moments as proof. Juliet had been counting something else. How often she had needed him. How often she had asked. How often she had waited. How often she had accepted an apology and tried again. Charles slowly pushed the papers away. None of the individual moments looked big enough to destroy a marriage. That was exactly what frightened him, because now he could see how many small moments it took to make Juliet stop expecting anything from him, and there was one thing he still couldn't understand. If she had been trying this hard to tell him, why hadn't she ever simply said she was done? Charles found Juliet at her parents' house 2 days later. He had called first. Her father had answered. "Can I see her?" A long pause. "Come by." That was all. Juliet met him on the back porch while her mother stayed inside with the twins. Charles stood near the steps. Juliet kept several feet between them. For a moment neither spoke. Then Charles held up the folder. "You kept all this?" Juliet looked at it. "Yes." "Why?" She looked toward the yard. "I told you." "When?" Juliet turned back to him. "When did you tell me?" Her face remained calm. "That I was going to leave." "No." "That you were unhappy?" Charles hesitated. "You never said you were unhappy enough to leave." Juliet gave a small, tired laugh. "I wasn't asking you to predict the future. Then what were you asking me to do?" "Listen." Charles looked down. "I did listen." Juliet shook her head. "You heard me." He frowned. "What's the difference? I'd tell you something. You'd say you understood. Then we'd have the same conversation 2 weeks later. That doesn't mean I wasn't listening. It means nothing changed." Charles looked away. "I was working. I know. I was trying to provide for you and the babies. I know. I was under pressure. I know." He looked back at her. "Then what did you want from me?" Juliet was quiet. "More than money." Charles's jaw tightened. "I gave you everything I could." "No." She said it softly. "You gave me what you thought a family needed." Charles didn't answer. Juliet folded her arms. "I needed you at the appointments. I couldn't always make them. I know. I had work. I know." "Then why are you acting like I chose not to be there?" Juliet looked at him. "Because sometimes you did." Charles stared at her. She continued before he could answer. "I wasn't asking you to come to every appointment. I was asking you to understand that when you said you'd come, I believed you." Charles looked down at the folder. "You could have told me you were this unhappy." Juliet's eyes moved to his face. "I did." "When?" "The night I asked you if you even noticed when you weren't here." Charles went still. "That wasn't about the appointments." "No." "What was it about?" "You." He swallowed. "I told you I was right there. I know." You didn't explain. I shouldn't have had to explain every feeling like a legal argument. Charles looked frustrated. Then what was I supposed to do? Ask. I asked. Once. Silence. Juliet looked away. There were nights I sat next to you and tried to figure out how to say what I needed without making you feel attacked. Charles's expression changed slightly. I didn't know that. I know. That answer hurt more than anger would have. He took a breath. Why didn't you just tell me you were thinking about leaving? Juliet looked at him for several seconds. Because I wasn't. Charles frowned. What? I wasn't thinking about leaving. Then, I was thinking about how to stay. He stopped. Juliet's voice stayed quiet. That was the whole point. She looked toward the house. I kept asking for things that would have made staying easier. Charles didn't speak. I asked you to come home earlier sometimes. I did. Sometimes. I tried. I know. She looked back at him. That was enough to keep me trying too. Charles rubbed his forehead. Then when did it change? Juliet looked down at her hands. I don't know exactly. Then how can you say I didn't listen? Because I stopped asking. Charles looked at her. She continued, not because I didn't need anything anymore. Her voice caught slightly. Because I got tired of asking. Neither spoke. From inside the house came the faint sound of one of the twins crying. Juliet turned instinctively toward the door. Charles did too. Neither moved. After a moment, Juliet said, That's why I wrote things down. Charles looked at her, because I was starting to forget what I had asked for. He lowered the folder. You really think I didn't care? Juliet's eyes filled. I think you cared. She paused. I just don't think you understood how much I needed you to show it. Charles swallowed. He looked toward the house again. I love those kids. I know. I love you. Juliet didn't answer. Charles noticed. The silence stretched. Finally he said, You don't believe me. Juliet shook her head. No. He looked hurt. She corrected herself. I believe you love me. A pause. I just don't know if loving me was enough for you to change. Charles looked down. For once he had no answer ready. Juliet stepped toward the door. He spoke behind her. Did you ever give me a real chance? Her hand rested on the doorknob. She didn't turn around. I gave you so many chances that eventually I stopped recognizing them as chances. Then she went inside. Charles remained on the porch. He looked down at the folder in his hands. For years he had imagined that if Juliet ever left, there would be one final argument he could point to. One sentence, one moment, something he could fix. But standing there, listening to his daughter's cry from the other side of the door, Charles was beginning to understand that Juliet hadn't left because of one moment. She had left after hundreds of moments in which he had waited for him to notice. Charles didn't leave the porch right away. Juliet had gone inside, and the door had closed softly behind her. He stood there with the folder under his arm, listening to the muffled sounds of the house. A few minutes later, his phone rang. Frederick. You talked to her? Yes. And? Charles looked at the closed door. She says she told me. Frederick was quiet. Did she? Charles almost said no. Then he remembered the appointments, the questions, the message, the night in the kitchen. Yeah, he said. She did. Frederick waited, but she stopped. Why? Charles rubbed his forehead. She got tired. There was a pause. Charles, that's not the whole story. I know. He ended the call. When he got home that evening, the house felt different. Not because anything had moved, because he had. He walked into the kitchen and saw the same counter where Juliet used to leave the twins' bottles. His phone buzzed. A message from his mother. You need to fight for your family. Don't let Juliet make you feel like the bad guy. Charles read it twice. He almost replied. Instead, he put the phone down. The next morning, he called Juliet. She answered on the fourth ring. Hello? Charles sat down. Can we talk? A pause. About what? I don't know. Juliet waited. I think I need to apologize. She didn't respond immediately. For what? Charles swallowed. For the things in the file. Which things? He looked down. All of it. That isn't an apology. He closed his eyes. I missed appointments. I canceled things. I wasn't home when I said I would be. Yes, I kept telling myself work was the reason. It was, but it wasn't the only reason. Juliet was silent. Charles continued. I made you feel like everything else came before you. She didn't correct him. That silence told him enough. Then he said, but you shut me out too. Juliet exhaled. I know. You stopped telling me things. Yes, you knew I was already struggling at work, and you kept things from me. I did. Charles looked surprised. I didn't expect you to agree. I don't need to defend every mistake I made. He leaned back. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then Charles said, you told your parents things were fine. Yes. You told Sarah. Yes. You told me things were fine. Juliet's voice was quiet. Sometimes. Why? Because I was tired. That doesn't explain it. No. She paused. It doesn't. Charles waited. Juliet continued. I was afraid that if I said everything out loud, I'd have to make a decision. What decision? Whether to stay. Charles's chest tightened. So you knew. So you knew. I wasn't trying to busted. She sounded exhausted. He looked toward the empty homie. Juliet gave a small, sad laugh. That sentence. Now it didn't sound like an accusation. It sounded like exhaustion. Charles took a breath. I cheated on you. The line went quiet. He hadn't said it that plainly before. Not to her, not to himself. I have no excuse for that. No. I hurt you. Yes. Charles swallowed. But I don't want you to think everything between us was fake. Juliet didn't answer. He continued. I loved our life. She was quiet for a long time. I loved parts of it too. The words hurt. Charles looked down. Parts? Juliet didn't answer. He understood enough. Then she said, Charles, this isn't about deciding which one of us was worse. He listened. You hurt me. I know. I hurt you too. He looked up. You did? I withdrew. I stopped explaining. Sometimes I punished you by going quiet instead of saying what I needed. Charles said nothing. I know that wasn't fair. He leaned back. For the first time, the conversation didn't feel like a trial. Neither of them was trying to win. But that didn't make the truth easier. Charles asked, So what does that mean? I don't know. You don't want to come home? Juliet took a breath. No. He looked down. She continued before he could speak. Not right now. That small phrase carried more weight than he expected. Not never, not yes, just not right now. Charles nodded slowly. Can I see the twins? Yes. When? I'll let you know. He wanted to argue. He didn't. Okay. Juliet was quiet. Then she said, Charles? Yeah? Don't make this about winning. He looked at the phone. I won't. The call ended. Charles remained at the kitchen table. His mother's message was still on his phone. Fight for your family. He read it again, then deleted it. He didn't know what came next. He only knew that getting Juliet back was no longer something he could demand, negotiate, or explain his way into. For now, all he could do was decide what kind of man he was going to be when nobody was asking him to prove it. At first, Charles kept every visit with the twins like it was an appointment he couldn't afford to miss. He arrived early. He brought diapers. He brought formula. He texted Juliet when he was 5 minutes away. He even started keeping a small bag in his car with extra clothes and bottles. Juliet noticed. So did his parents. His mother told him, See, this is what you need to keep doing. Charles nodded, but the truth was, he was still watching Juliet. Every time she opened the door, he looked at her face. Every time she thanked him, he listened for something more. Every time she smiled at one of the babies, he wondered whether she was noticing that he was trying. One Saturday, he arrived with a new stroller. Juliet looked at it. You bought another one? I thought this one would be easier. The other one works. I know. She glanced at him. Then why'd you buy it? Charles didn't have a good answer. He had wanted to bring something she could see, something that said he was changing. Juliet simply nodded. Okay. The word bothered him. He almost asked what she meant. Then he stopped himself. That was something new. He didn't always have to know what she was thinking. He spent the afternoon with the twins instead. One of them wouldn't settle down. Charles tried rocking her. Nothing. He walked around the living room. Nothing. He checked the bottle. Nothing. Finally, Juliet came into the room. She's tired. I've been trying. I know. Minute the baby quieted. Charles watched. What did I do wrong? You didn't. He frowned. She just needed this. Juliet looked at him. You're learning. It wasn't praise, it wasn't criticism either. Charles nodded. Okay. A few weeks later he missed an appointment. Not because he chose work, because he had written the wrong time in his calendar. He realized 20 minutes before the appointment. His first instinct was to call Juliet and explain. Then he stopped. He could already hear himself. I thought it was at 2. I had it marked wrong. I'm sorry. Instead, he called the doctor's office. He couldn't make it in time, so he rescheduled the appointment himself. Then he called Juliet. I messed up. She waited. I put the wrong time down. I won't make it. There was a pause. Okay, I already rescheduled it. Another pause. What time? Thursday at 10. That's fine. Charles waited. She didn't say anything else. He almost started explaining. Then he remembered the file. He had spent years believing that an explanation should erase the inconvenience. Sometimes it didn't. Okay, he said. They hung up. That evening, Charles changed his work calendar. He moved 2 recurring meetings. He told his assistant that anything involving the twins went on his schedule first. She looked at him. Everything? Charles nodded. If I say it's important, it's important. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody applauded. Juliet didn't know, and for the first time that didn't bother him as much. A month passed. Charles learned which twin hated being rocked too quickly. He learned which bottle made one of them spit up. He learned that one of them slept better with the hallway light on. He started asking questions instead of assuming Juliet would handle everything. Do they have enough diapers? Is the pediatrician still Thursday? Do you need me to pick up the prescription? Sometimes Juliet answered. Sometimes she said no. Sometimes she corrected him. Charles listened. One afternoon, after dropping off the twins, he stood beside the car while Juliet buckled them in. I'll get them Friday. Juliet nodded. You don't have to keep telling me. I know. He closed the car door. Then he stopped. I used to think showing up once proved I cared. Juliet looked at him. Charles shook his head. I'm realizing it doesn't. She didn't answer. He didn't wait for one. He walked away. That was when something changed. Not in Juliet. In Charles. He was still hoping she would notice, but he was beginning to understand that if his only reason for changing was to get her attention, then he hadn't really changed at all. So he kept showing up, even on the days Juliet wasn't there to see it, even when nobody thanked him, even when the twins were too young to remember, and slowly, without announcing it, Charles stopped trying to prove he was a good father. He started trying to be one. Charles noticed it on a Tuesday afternoon. Juliet didn't remind him about the twins' appointment. She didn't text him the night before. She didn't ask whether he was still coming. She didn't even mention it when he arrived. Charles stood in the driveway with the diaper bag over his shoulder. I've got them at 10 tomorrow, right? Juliet looked at him. Yeah. You don't need to remind me? She gave him a small smile. You already wrote it down. Charles nodded. Right. He should have been pleased. Instead, something about it bothered him. A few weeks earlier, Juliet would have checked twice. She would have asked what time he was leaving work. She would have reminded him to bring the bottles. Now she simply trusted the calendar. Or maybe she had stopped caring whether he remembered. Charles couldn't tell which. Later that afternoon, after he brought the twins home, he found Juliet sitting at the kitchen table. She was folding tiny clothes. Charles placed the diaper bag down. Can I ask you something? She looked up. Sure. Why don't you get mad anymore? Juliet's hands stopped. I do. Not like before. She folded another shirt. I don't know. Yes, you do. She looked at him. Charles pulled out the chair across from her. You used to ask me where I was. You'd ask when I was coming home. You'd get upset when I missed things. Juliet looked down at the clothes. And now? Now you just handle it. She gave a faint smile. I've had practice. Charles didn't smile. Is that what you wanted? Juliet was quiet. No. The answer came so quickly that he looked away. What did you want? She set the shirt down. I wanted you to notice. I notice now. I know, but you don't seem to care. Juliet looked at him. I care. Then why don't you get angry? She took a breath. Because I got tired. Charles stared at her. Tired of what? Being disappointed. He lowered his eyes. Juliet continued folding clothes. There was a point where I could tell exactly what was going to happen. What? You'd promise something. I'd believe you. You'd miss it. I'd get upset. We'd talk. You'd apologize. For a little while, things would be better. Charles didn't interrupt. Then something else would happen. She folded another shirt. After a while, I stopped waiting for the better part. Charles swallowed. So when I started changing, I noticed. You did? Yes. Then why don't you say anything? Juliet looked at him. Because I'm not sure what you're changing for. Charles frowned. For you. She shook her head. That's what I'm afraid of. He leaned back. What do you mean? If you're changing because you want me back, then what happens if I don't come back? Charles didn't answer. Juliet looked down at the clothes. I can't be the reward for you becoming responsible. The words stayed between them. Charles looked at her for a long time. Is that what you think I'm doing? I don't know. I'm trying. I know. Then what else do you want from me? Juliet shook her head. Nothing. Charles stared at her. Nothing? I'm not asking you for anything anymore. That hurt more than he expected. He looked toward the hallway. The twins were asleep. You used to ask. Yes. And now you don't. No. Why? Juliet's eyes stayed on the shirt in her hands. Because I learned how to stop expecting. Charles sat very still. He remembered the records, the appointments, the messages, all those little requests. He remembered how often he'd thought, we'll deal with it later. Now he understood what later had cost him. Were you waiting for me to change? Juliet looked at him for a long time. And now, she took a slow breath. Now I'm trying to decide what my life looks like without waiting. Charles looked down. There was no anger in her voice. That was what frightened him. If she had been angry, he could have argued. If she had accused him, he could have defended himself. But Juliet wasn't asking him to understand anymore. She was simply telling him where she was. Charles stood. I need to go. Juliet nodded. He picked up his keys. At the door, he turned. I am changing. She looked at him. I know. He waited. She added, you should. Charles nodded once. Then he left. In the car, he sat without starting the engine. He had spent weeks hoping Juliet would notice his effort. Now he understood that she had noticed. She simply wasn't waiting for it anymore. And somehow, that was harder to accept than her anger. Because anger would have meant she still expected something from him. Juliet had stopped expecting, and Charles finally understood what that meant. He was becoming the man she had once needed at the exact moment she was learning how to live without him. The custody meeting was supposed to last an hour. It lasted 20 minutes. Charles sat beside Frederick while Juliet sat across the table with her attorney. There were papers between them, schedules, proposed visitation times, medical information, expenses for the twins. Charles looked at the calendar. Thursday doesn't work. Frederick glanced at him. Why? I have a client meeting. Juliet looked down at the papers. Charles noticed. A few months earlier, he would have waited for someone else to solve it. Instead, he looked at the schedule again. Actually, move the meeting. Frederick frowned. You sure? Yeah. Charles pointed to the calendar. I'll take Thursday. Juliet looked up. Charles didn't look at her. The meeting continued. There were disagreements. Charles didn't like every proposed arrangement. Juliet didn't either. At one point, Charles's attorney asked whether he wanted to request additional time with the twins. Charles almost said yes. He wanted more time. He wanted to see them. He wanted his family back. Then he looked at the schedule. Juliet had arranged the twins' pediatric appointments around their feeding routine. The schedule wasn't convenient for either of them. It was what worked for the babies. Charles nodded. That works. Frederick looked at him. You're okay with that? For now. Juliet said nothing. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Outside, Charles caught up with Frederick. You think I gave up too much? Frederick shook his head. No. Charles looked back toward the building. I don't want her thinking I'm not fighting. Frederick stopped walking. Fighting for what? Charles didn't answer. For your children? Yes. For Juliet? Charles looked away. I still want her. Frederick nodded. I know. Charles rubbed the back of his neck. But I don't want to turn that into another thing she has to carry. Frederick studied him. That sounds different. It feels different. They walked toward the parking lot. Charles's phone buzzed. A message from Juliet. The twins are getting their shots Friday at 10. He stared at it. Then another message appeared. If you want to come, you're welcome. Charles looked at the screen for a few seconds. He typed, I'll be there. He sent it. No explanation, no question about what it meant. Just an answer. That evening his mother called. You went to the custody meeting? Yes. And it went fine. Are you fighting? Charles leaned against the kitchen counter. I don't know what you mean. You know exactly what I mean. You can't let her take everything. Charles closed his eyes. Mom, she's not taking everything. She took the babies. They're her children too. She left you. I know. You need to make her understand what she's doing to this family. Charles looked around the kitchen. No. What? I need to understand what I did. His mother went quiet. Charles continued. I don't want to spend the rest of my life blaming Juliet because she finally got tired. You're my son. I know. I just don't want you to lose your family. Charles looked toward the empty hallway. So do I. After they hung up, he sat alone for a while. Friday morning, Charles arrived at the pediatrician's office 10 minutes early. Juliet was already there. She looked surprised. You're early. I know. One of the twins began fussing. Charles reached for her. Juliet hesitated, then handed the baby over. He held her carefully. The nurse called them in. Charles stayed beside Juliet during the appointment. He asked questions. He listened to the doctor's instructions. He wrote down the next appointment himself. When it was over, Juliet gathered the diaper bag. Charles picked up the car seat. I've got it. She let him. Outside, they stood beside the car. Charles looked at her. I know this doesn't fix anything. Juliet nodded. I know. He glanced at the twins. I still want you. Juliet looked at him. Charles swallowed. But I'm not asking you to decide anything today. She watched him for a moment. I appreciate that. He nodded. I just want to be their father. You are their father. I know. He put the car seat into the car. For once he didn't add anything else. He didn't ask whether she noticed. He didn't ask whether she believed him. He didn't ask whether there was still a chance for them. He simply closed the door. Juliet stood beside him. Charles, he turned. You really don't have to keep proving it to me. He looked at her. I know. She nodded. Then she got into the car. Charles watched her pull away. His first instinct was to reach for his phone. He took it out, opened her contact, then stopped. He looked through the windshield as her car disappeared at the end of the street. He could have called. He could have asked where they were going. He could have asked when he could see the twins again. He could have asked whether any part of her still wanted him. He put the phone back in his pocket. Then he opened his calendar. The next appointment was already there. Charles stood beside his car for a moment looking at the date. He still wanted Juliet. That hadn't changed. But for the first time he understood that wanting her did not give him the right to ask her to return. So he got into his car, and instead of calling her, he drove back to work and rearranged his schedule for the appointment he had already promised to keep. No one saw him do it. Juliet didn't know. There was nothing to prove. He simply showed up for the life he had once taken for granted. The custody schedule stopped changing every few weeks. That was the first sign that things were becoming easier. Not easy, just easier. Charles picked up the twins on Fridays. Juliet had them Sunday evening. If a doctor changed an appointment, they told each other. If one of the babies was sick, Charles knew before he arrived, instead of finding out afterward. There were still disagreements. One Friday, Charles was 10 minutes late. Juliet opened the door and looked at her watch. You said 6. I know, traffic. She stepped aside. Okay. Charles almost explained. He could already hear himself talking about the road, the meeting that had run late, the reason he hadn't called. Instead, he looked at her. I should have called. Yes, he nodded. I'll leave earlier next time. She handed him the diaper bag. Good. That was it. No argument, no mention of the affair, no reopening everything that had already been said. Just 10 minutes. Charles learned to leave earlier. Juliet learned she didn't have to remind him. That change took longer for her than she expected. For months she had checked everything twice. The bottles, the diapers, the appointment times, the clothes, whether Charles remembered, what the twins needed. Then one afternoon, she caught herself typing a reminder into her phone. Charles picks them up Friday. Don't forget. She stopped. She looked at the unfinished message, then deleted it. He already knew. And when Friday came, Charles arrived with the right car seats, the diaper bag, and the medicine one of the twins needed. Juliet stood at the doorway. You remembered. Charles gave a small smile. Yeah. She nodded. Good. He left with the twins. Juliet closed the door. For a few seconds she stood there with her hand still on the knob. Then she walked back into the house. She didn't wait for a phone call. She didn't check the clock. She didn't wonder whether Charles would bring them back on time. At 8:45 her phone buzzed. They're asleep. Everything's fine. Juliet read the message. She typed, Thank you. Then she put the phone down. It was a small exchange, but neither of them was asking the other to carry more than necessary. That became the language of their new relationship. Not affection, not romance, responsibility. When Charles had a question, he asked instead of assuming. When Juliet needed to change his schedule, she told him early. When either of them was frustrated, they tried not to drag old arguments into new conversations. They didn't always succeed. One evening, Juliet changed a pickup time without asking him first. Charles stared at the message. I had already moved something around. I know, I should have called. You could have. I said I should have. Charles felt the old irritation rising. He could have listed everything he'd already rearranged. He could have reminded her how often he had accommodated her schedule. He could have turned one mistake into proof that she still didn't appreciate what he was doing. Instead, he took a breath. Okay, Juliet paused. Okay? Yeah. He rubbed his forehead. Next time, call me first. I will. That was the whole conversation. Later that night, Charles sat in his car before driving home. He thought about how strange it felt to disagree with Juliet without turning the disagreement into evidence. She didn't have to be the woman who hurt him. He didn't have to be the man who betrayed her. Sometimes they were simply two tired parents who had made a mistake. That was new. And slowly, Juliet began noticing something else. Charles no longer used the twins as a reason to stay connected to her. He didn't ask personal questions disguised as parenting questions. He didn't linger at the door. He didn't search her face for signs that she missed him. When he left, he left. When he came back for the children. It made things easier. It also made Juliet trust him in a different way. Not as her husband, not yet as a friend, just as the father of her children. One Sunday evening, after Charles returned the twins, Juliet stood beside the doorway while he checked the diaper bag. You're missing one bottle. Charles looked inside. Right. He walked back to his car. Juliet watched him return with it. Got it. Thanks. He handed it over. Then he looked at the twins. Good night, guys. He kissed each forehead. Juliet watched him walk down the driveway. She expected the old ache to return. Instead, she felt something quieter. Trust, not the kind she had once given her husband. Something smaller, something earned. She knew Charles would show up for the twins, and for now, that was enough. But as Juliet closed the door, she realized something she wasn't quite ready to say out loud. Learning to trust Charles as their father was becoming easier. Figuring out what she felt about the man he was becoming was going to be much harder. Juliet realized she was thinking about Charles again on a Wednesday night. Not because he had called, he hadn't. Not because he had done anything wrong, he hadn't. It was because Sarah had asked her a simple question earlier that afternoon. Do you trust him now? Juliet had answered without thinking. With the babies? Yes. Sarah had looked at her. And with you? Juliet hadn't answered. Now, sitting at the kitchen table after the twins were asleep, she understood why. The first kind of trust had become easier. The second was different. She had spent months learning how to separate Charles the father from Charles the husband, and lately that separation had become harder. He was more patient, more reliable. He listened. He didn't push. He didn't use every visit with the twins as an excuse to ask whether she had changed her mind. That should have made things simple. It didn't. The following Friday, Charles came to pick up the twins. Juliet handed him the diaper bag. "Everything's in there." "Okay." He took it, then he hesitated. "Sarah mentioned you're taking that class again." Juliet looked at him. "You talked to Sarah? About the twins? Oh, I wasn't trying to pry. I know." He nodded. "I'm glad you're doing it." Juliet studied his face. There was no hidden request, no attempt to make the conversation about them. "Thank you." Charles smiled. "See you Sunday." He turned toward the car. Juliet watched him go. "Charles?" He turned. She almost didn't say it. "Are you happy?" He looked surprised. "I don't know." That answer made her smile faintly. "Fair enough." He gave a small laugh. "Why?" Juliet looked down at the diaper bag. "I was just wondering." Charles nodded. Then he left. That night, Juliet called Sarah. "You asked me if I trusted him. I remember. I think I do." Sarah was quiet. "With the babies? With everything? That sounds like a big change." "It is." Sarah waited. Juliet sighed. "But that doesn't mean I want my marriage back." But that toward the twins' room. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. What forgiveness means when you don't want to forget." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Maybe it means you don't have to keep being angry." Juliet looked down at the table. "I'm not angry anymore." "Then what are you?" Juliet thought about it. Careful. The word felt right. She had forgiven Charles in pieces, not all at once. She had forgiven him enough to stop replaying every conversation, enough to stop wondering whether she should have noticed the affair sooner, enough to stop imagining different versions of the night he came home. But forgiveness hadn't erased what happened, and it hadn't created an obligation to return. A few weeks later, Charles asked if they could talk after dropping off the twins. Juliet agreed. They sat on the front porch. Charles looked uncomfortable. "I've been wanting to ask you something." Juliet waited. "Are you ever going to forgive me?" She looked at him. "I already have." Charles blinked. "You have?" "Yes." He looked down. "I didn't know. You weren't supposed to." He gave a quiet laugh. "That's fair." Juliet folded her hands in her lap. "Forgiving you doesn't mean what happened didn't matter. I know, and it doesn't mean I owe you another chance." "I know." Charles looked at her. "I used to think those were the same thing. They're not. No." He looked toward the driveway. "I think I'm finally starting to understand that." Juliet nodded. They sat quietly for a moment. Then Charles said, "I miss you." Juliet's expression softened. "I know. I still do." She looked at him. "I miss parts of us too." Charles turned toward her. She continued before he could respond. "But I don't know if I miss the marriage we actually had." He looked down. That answer hurt, but he didn't argue. Juliet noticed. That more than anything told her something had changed. The old Charles would have tried to convince her. He would have reminded her of the good years. He would have promised things would be different. This Charles simply nodded. "I understand." Juliet looked at him. "Do you?" He took a breath. "Not completely." That made her smile. "That's probably more honest." He smiled too, then the smile faded. "I don't want you to forgive me because you feel sorry for me. I don't, and I don't want you to come back because I'm finally doing what I should have done years ago." Juliet looked at him carefully. "Good." Charles nodded. "I just wanted you to know I'm sorry." "I know." He stood. "So, we're okay?" Juliet considered the question. "We're getting there." Charles accepted that. He walked toward his car. Juliet remained on the porch. She watched him open the driver's door. For a moment she almost called his name. She didn't. Charles got into the car and drove away. Juliet stayed where she was. A few minutes later she noticed one of the twins' little socks lying near the porch steps. She picked it up and smiled despite herself. Then she looked toward the driveway. The house was quiet again. She held the tiny sock in her hand for a moment before walking inside. She still didn't know what Charles's return to her life meant, but for the first time she wasn't afraid of finding out. 3 months later, Juliet found Charles asleep on the living room floor. One of the twins was curled against his chest. The other was lying beside him, one tiny hand wrapped around the edge of his shirt. Juliet stopped in the doorway. Charles had fallen asleep waiting for them to finish their nap. She almost walked away. Then one of the babies stirred. Charles opened his eyes. "Oh," he carefully lifted his head. "I didn't mean to fall asleep." Juliet smiled. "You've been up since 5. I know." She looked at the twins. "They look comfortable." "They are." Charles sat up slowly. Juliet watched him for a moment. Then she said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Are you still waiting for me?" Charles knew what she meant. He looked down at his hands. "I don't know. That isn't an answer." He gave a small smile. "I guess part of me is." Juliet nodded. "Why haven't you asked?" Charles looked at her. "Because you told me not to make this about winning. And I finally understood what you meant." Juliet waited. "If I spend every day being good to you because I'm hoping you'll give me something back, then I'm still making everything about me." She looked at him carefully. "That took you a while." "Yeah." A quiet laugh escaped her. Charles smiled. Then the room went quiet again. Juliet sat on the other end of the couch. "I've been thinking." Charles didn't move. "About us." "Yes." His expression changed, but he didn't interrupt. Juliet looked toward the twins. "I don't want the marriage we had." Charles nodded. "I know. I don't want to pretend the affair didn't happen. I know. I don't want to go back to the way things were." "You shouldn't." She looked at him. "But I don't think I want to spend the rest of my life pretending I don't care about you either." Charles stared at her. He didn't speak. Juliet took a breath. "I still care." His eyes lowered. "I care about the man you're becoming." She paused. "And I care about the father you've become." Charles swallowed. "But I need to know something." "What?" "If we ever tried again, would you understand that it wouldn't be about getting the old marriage back?" Charles nodded slowly. "It would have to be something different." "What does different mean?" He thought about it. "Slow." Juliet smiled faintly. "Very slow. I can do slow. You've said that before." Charles almost smiled. "I know." That made her laugh softly. It was the first time they had laughed together in a long time. Not because everything was fixed. It wasn't. Because for a few seconds they didn't have to pretend it was. Juliet looked at him. "I don't know if I can be your wife again." Charles nodded. "I understand." She looked down at her hands. "But I think I'd like to get to know you again." Charles looked at her. "As what?" Juliet almost answered, then stopped. "I don't know." He waited. She shook her head. "Let's not name it yet." Charles nodded. "Okay." Juliet looked at him for another moment. "And I'm not promising anything." "I know." That answer seemed to settle something in her. Charles stood and picked up the diaper bag. Juliet watched him. Then she reached for the other one. "Tomorrow, the twins have their appointment." "I know. Do you want to come?" Charles looked at her. "Yes." Juliet nodded. "Okay." They walked toward the door together. Neither of them said they were getting back together. Neither promised that the past was forgotten. Neither pretended trust could be rebuilt in one conversation. Juliet opened the door. Charles stepped outside. For a moment they stood beside each other. Then Juliet locked the door behind them. Charles started toward his car. Juliet followed. She noticed something as they walked. For the first time since he had left that night, she wasn't walking ahead of him, and he wasn't trying to catch up. They were simply walking beside each other. She didn't know what would happen next. Neither did he. But neither of them was trying to force the answer anymore, and maybe that was the first thing they had finally learned to do right. "Before you go, I want to ask you something. Have you ever reached a point where you stopped being angry with someone, not because what they did didn't hurt, but because you finally realized you couldn't keep carrying that hurt with you? And maybe you've also learned that forgiveness doesn't always mean going back. Sometimes it means letting go of what happened, learning from it, and choosing what deserves another chance. If Charles and Juliet's story touched something in you, tell me in the comments. Do you believe a broken relationship can be rebuilt after trust has been lost, or are some things better left in the past? There are no right or wrong answers. I genuinely love to hear your story. And if this story reminded you of someone who needed to hear that change is possible but trust has to be earned, share this story with them. If you want more stories about love, family, mistakes, second chances, and the choices that change our lives, subscribe to Greer Stories and stay with us. Because sometimes, the most powerful part of a story isn't what someone did wrong. It's what they choose to do after they finally understand the damage they've caused. Thank you for being part of our Greer Stories family.